I'm a teacher and I'll always be in that sense, and hopefully always also a student. That's the more important thing. If you believe you know the truth without even asking questions, then you don't think. And for me, that's the biggest threat to being human. We need to teach people the scientific process. Skeptical inquiry, testing, retesting are vitally important for the public to make them responsible adults in a pseudo-democratic society. We are creating an Earth already at the carbon levels in the atmosphere that has not been seen for over 5 million years.
What do you say to people that say that climate change is just a natural cycle?
It's not rocket science. It's just basic chemistry. It's the fact that it's already happening. There's physical impacts of climate change, sea level rise, storms, and all the things people talk about. But I think almost more worrisome is the socio-political impacts of climate change. 500 million to 1 billion people who are going to be displaced. So if you're worried about a few thousand boat migrants, you're going to have a flood of people.
We will build a great wall.
What's becoming clearer is it does seem to be generational, that young people are recognizing the impacts and need to respond to climate change.
The young people want to be heard.
It seems to me the only way ultimately is give information and try and educate them, how to sift that information, how to check sources. That's the kind of training we need to do in schools. And if you don't have those tools, then you're much more easily manipulated by whoever is in power.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Lawrence Krauss is the guy that makes physics interesting. He's a professor, but he's also known for interviewing Johnny Depp on stage in front of 3,000 people. And his Origins podcast has guests like Ricky Gervais and Noam Chomsky. And I had an amazing conversation with Lawrence the second time he was in the studio. We talked about black holes, about global warming, and all the crazy stuff he's up to lately. You also might remember him from that movie, The Unbelievers, with Richard Dawkins, where they debate people about religion. Lawrence always has something interesting to say, so I know you're going to enjoy this incredible episode with Lawrence Krauss. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Lawrence Krauss, the theoretical physicist, cosmologist, and best-selling author. You've written over 300 scientific publications and 9 books, including the bestsellers The Physics of Star Trek and A Universe from Nothing. You've also served as the Science Policy Committee for President Barack Obama, acted in Hollywood films, and run the Origins Project Foundation, dedicated to hosting public panel discussions and podcasts on science, culture, and social issues. Lawrence, welcome back to London Real.
Well, it's great to be back here. It's great to be in the new studio and be with you again. It's 10 books, but who's counting? and I should say, because of that, the foundation is a separate foundation from the podcast. They're 2 separate things.
Okay, good.
And I have to say that because the foundation is a tax-exempt or entity, and the podcast is.
Ah, well put, well put.
Yeah, okay.
And you've been podcasting like a madman lately.
Yes,
You've had Noam Chomsky on, and Penn Jillette, and a bunch of other people
Ricky
in the
Gervais.
Ricky Gervais.
Yeah, it's a great mix of. It's an amazingly fun, eclectic, and exhausting mix.
You're copying us.
Well, I'd like to think I'm complimenting you.
And video is super important for you.
Yeah, yeah.
And if anyone hasn't seen your movie, The Unbelievers, with Richard Dawkins, it's really well shot. It's a great film, and you have the same guys working.
The same crew that made that movie is making the podcast, and we wanted to try and produce a podcast with really high production value, so you can listen to it in the car, as a lot of people listen to podcasts, but you can watch the whole thing, and it's beautifully produced. And while we and I love your studio. And what we built a really neat studio in Phoenix where we have filmed some of them, but in order to get the people we've gone around the world. In fact, that's the reason I'm in London now. We're just recording a number of fascinating ones. I won't mention names.
Right, and you always cut across barriers and genres. I mean, people know you for having Johnny Depp on the stage, you know, with 3,000 people having conversations about all sorts of things. How do you get to know all these people?
You know, it's a mystery to me. It sort of builds on it. One thing happens and then another. I am fortunate to have a wide network of friends and people who know me. Obviously began, for the most part, except for the scientific community, most of whom I've known through my science. But beyond that, with the books, it sort of began, and it's always surprising to me, it still is, when someone I really admire knows who I am or is a fan. In fact, well, with Johnny, I met him because he came to a lecture of mine and was backstage, and they said, there's someone backstage who wants to see you. And I came in, and there he was. He said, you know, I watch you every day on TV, and I felt like saying, well, that's interesting. And it was a surprise. But you know, I'm a huge fan of Johnny's, and we're mutual admirers. But so it just picks up, and for me, the connection between science and culture is really important. So I've tried in my books and in everything to try and point out science is just part of our culture like everything else. It's not separate. It's not different than art or literature or TV or movies. And I've had fun to try and reach out in different ways. So these things sort of happen, one thing after another, and I'm kind of surprised. I'm so surprised when people agree to be on or do something with me or for me. And then, yeah, anyway, it builds up. But it's been neat and exciting and challenging.
And tell me about London. What are your feelings like when you come to a place like this? What do you think about London when you're baking in the heat in Phoenix?
Well, happily, by the way, I don't live in Phoenix anymore. I moved up to Oregon, which is much nicer.
Okay.
And we film in Phoenix, so I fly down. I used to commute to Australia, where my wife was, so commuting from Portland to Phoenix is much easier. I'm a big fan of London, and I hope to be a big fan of London in the future, if London is still here after Brexit. But we'll see. It's very comfortable. I actually have been teaching part-time at a place called New College of Humanities. I would come in and give 3 or 4 lectures a year and stay for a period of 3 or 4 weeks. And it's very comfortable for me. I grew up in Canada too, so the British influence was big on me there anyway.
And what about from a science perspective?
Oh well, I've always had great colleagues here, and that's, to be serious, that's always my initial concern about Brexit, by the way, early on, was all my science colleagues. Because what I don't think people realized, and maybe now they do, but Britain gets so much in the way of science because of its connection to Europe. There's money flowing in to support scientific research that's going to disappear. And one of the first things that I thought is, well, in a mercurial sense, I thought, oh good, this would be a great chance to recruit all our colleagues from Britain because they'll all want to move to the United States. But then we elected Donald Trump, and so it's we've had our own issues. But it's a real problem. But there's a great research establishment. I used to spend time up in Cambridge and almost took a position to succeed my friend Richard Dawkins, actually at Oxford. And it's a position of public understanding of science. And what I didn't want to do though was move to Oxford full time, because I think if you're talking about public misunderstanding of science and you don't have a foot in the United States, that's probably the heart of popular misunderstanding of science. Right now, our government is based on misunderstanding of science, and so I didn't want to move full time, and that was a factor. But it's a vibrant and amazing city, and the UK in general. I learned to love it back actually when I was a graduate student. I was up in St. Andrews for a month, and that's before I knew how to golf. I've been back since there, and then 20 years later I went back to lecture there. So I have a long history of throughout the UK, Durham, and it's a great tradition of physics, obviously, and science, and education, and so it's it's a pleasure to visit. And I try and make sure I interact with colleagues. And we actually filmed, happily, part of the Unbelievers in the Royal Society building, thanks to, at the time, Martin Rees, who we've now done a podcast with, which will appear in a little while, who was the president of the Royal Society, as well as having been head of the Trinity College in Oxford and the Royal Astronomer.
Yeah, it's nice.
Let us film there, and it was a wonderful place to film.
I was at the Royal Society when the Imperial College folks did their presentation on the LSD research, and Professor David Nutt and Robin Carhart Harris and all of the whole crew was there. It's a great place.
It is a neat place, and I was glad they let me and Richard. Well, Richard's a member of the Royal Society. That was, I have to say, as a kind of, and a Canadian, and a sort of maybe a, I'm not sure, an Anglophile in that sense, but if I'd taken, as a Canadian, if I'd taken the job in the UK, I could have been eligible to be in the Royal Society, and that just sounded so good.
That would make your mom happy.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, now it would. My mother was, very unhappy when I decided to become a physicist.
Really? What did she want you to do?
Be a doctor, of course.
Of course.
And in fact, when I was at, I got my first job was it was a pretty prestigious job at Harvard right after I got my PhD, and right after I heard I got that job, I was in Boston at the time, and she phoned my then wife at the time. We'd just gotten married, and I was out of the house, and she said, there's still time to convince him to go to medical school. What's he want to do, get chalk on his hands? Anyway, now she's proud, but for a long time, she wanted my brother to be a lawyer and me to be a doctor. And my brother became a lawyer. In fact, he became worse. He became a professor of law. I
think you did pretty good, Lawrence.
Yeah, anyway. Yeah, no, it's okay now.
So
She's
last
happy
Friday, I went down to Westminster to witness the global climate protest. And it was pretty fascinating. We actually took my film crew down there because we're making a whole documentary about all sorts of things, from plant medicine to childhood trauma to you name it. And I went down and I saw all these children protesting. I'd never actually seen that before. Parents and kids and a lot of 10-year-olds and 14-year-olds, and it was massive. And I had never seen that, and I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Well, I think we'll see. I mean, I'm always skeptical. The fact that young people are involved is particularly important. I was just having this conversation with a writer, Ian McEwan, who I was talking to yesterday here in England, and you realize that there can be a sea change. The example that always hit me was gay rights. I mean, 15 years ago, the thought that it would just be accepted in the United States to have gay marriage was just impossible. But when I realized what was going to happen when my daughter, maybe this was 20 years ago, and my daughter was a teenager, and she had gay friends, and it was nothing. And I realized for them, being gay was nothing. And then I realized, well, no matter what old white men on the Supreme Court or in Senate think, the next generation, for them, it's nothing. And you can see things change instantaneously when generationally you can produce that change. And what's really becoming clearer, I was more skeptical a year ago, but what's becoming clearer is it does seem to be generational in the sense that it cuts across political lines, that young people are recognizing the impacts and need to respond to climate change in a way that just isn't happening for older people. And when that happens, that means things can change quickly, which they have to, by the way. I mean, it's already, in many ways, too late, because climate change is already happening and having severe impacts. I actually just wrote a piece, which I just got translated into German today, so I re-released it, but on the dark side of climate change, because there's physical impacts of climate change, sea level rise, storms, and all the things people talk about. But I think almost more worrisome, because they are more immediate and may trigger effects that are much scarier for humans across the planet, is the socio-political impacts of climate change. And the example I used at the time was a big issue in the United States, and to some extent in England, because it's one of the hearts behind Brexit, I think, is question of immigration, of illegal immigration. And as I used to say in Australia, it's nothing. When the Australian government stopped their carbon tax, but at the same time was worried about boat people coming in and they put them on this awful island outside Australia that wouldn't let them come in. I said, well, you have probably 500 million to 1 billion people who are going to be displaced because of climate change in the next 30 years, say. Sea level rise and droughts, or all sorts of things. And where's the nearest place they can go with a lot of empty space? It's Australia. So if you're worried about a few thousand boat migrants, you're going to have a flood of people. And the United States right now, of course, Trump and his wall, and worry about immigration from Central and South America, you can already see that climate change is impacting, producing droughts, and what it causes is people to want to move, especially in agrarian society. So I did the data and pointed out that the same government that's sort of denying or not attempting to do nothing to impact on climate change, in fact, negatively impacting, because one of the ways to get people to not immigrate is to help them grow things where they are. But the aid programs that the United States used to do to help people doing that are being cut back. And so they're worried about 50,000 migrants now, but it's estimated that maybe 10% of the population of Mexico may want to move over the next 40 years because of that impact. So it's called the dark side of climate change, but migration will produce these incredible tensions as it's doing, and that breeds xenophobia. It also breeds unrest in various countries. And so I'm worried about those indirect impacts of climate change in a world that is connected whether we want it or not. And while the physical aspects of climate change can't be stopped, I mean, we've already put in the atmosphere enough carbon dioxide that will last over 1,000 years in the atmosphere to have an impact of a few degrees, okay? So we can, of course, try and curtail it and make it not 5 degrees, that we should be acting. And I'll tell you the reasons why we should act quickly on that. But what will happen more immediately are the indirect impacts and tensions and wars, and it's poor countries and places that are hotbeds from Bangladesh to Pakistan, and some of those countries like Pakistan have nuclear weapons, and there's all of these indirect effects that we have to realize. And that's why, by the way, in the United States, while certain people may deny the existence of climate change, if you look at the national security community, they've been looking at that and recognizing the reality of it for a long time, because they have to. They have to look at the real world, not the world that's trying to be sold to people. And they have to say, what are the security implications and how can we address them?
If like 40 million people try to immigrate.
Yeah, or if it causes social disturbances in a country that has weapons of mass destruction,
right,
or countries that are allied, or countries that say become unlivable, but right now provide a significant amount of fossil fuel. I mean, there's all sorts of social of security implications, and they have to look at that.
Right.
And so it's just like Noam Chomsky, who we've had in our podcast as well, as an old friend for many years, used to tell me when I was a student, did my PhD at MIT, and I would sit in his classes, that if you want to understand what's really happening, read the business magazines and the business pages, because in order for those people to make money, they have to know what's really happening, and they have to. So they're not. There's all this gloss and propaganda that's thrown out. But if you really want to tie into what's really happening in the world, what you really want to do if you can be a successful business person, and so he used to say that, and it's true. If you look at the business or military, you'll see what's really happening.
And can you expand more on this kind of 1 degree or 2 degree versus 5 degree, and what we can do and why it's important to act now?
Well, let me first promote. I had a wonderful podcast which already appeared with Dan Schrag, who's a professor at Harvard, a geophysicist, who was actually also. I advised Obama before he became president. I was on that committee, but when he was president, I wasn't an advisor. Right. But Dan was on his council of advisors for 8 years, and he's an expert on climate change. And it's an amazing episode about discussing the physical implications of climate change, and what we might do to deal with it. It is, on the one hand, terrifying, but on the other hand, inspiring, because the point is that by recognizing what's already happened and what is inevitably happening, we do have abilities, technological abilities, to try and deal with things. Not to necessarily reverse climate change. Extracting carbon from the atmosphere would be wonderful, but that's quite a challenge. But to try and find technologies that are going to either mediate it in the future or allow us to change the way we live as a society to deal with the impacts of climate change. But there are Greenland, of course, which Trump wanted to buy, is of great interest because it's, I guess when I first started to get concerned about climate change was looking at the record over the last 500,000 years of sea level rise and temperatures. We can actually correlate those two things by looking at ice cores in the South Pole and other places. We can actually measure the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the mean temperature, and the sea level rise. And sea level has changed by plus or minus, not inches, but 80 meters over that time. And so when you realize that, you've got to say, well, it's true that predictions of global modeling and climate modeling have uncertainties. But when you have the possibility of sea level rise, not by inches, but by meters or tens of meters, you got to ask, is it worth the risk? Is it worth hedging your bets and saying, well, we can't prove that things will necessarily rise by that amount. But here's one example. Right now, the Earth isn't heating up as much as it could because that heat is going into the ocean. The oceans haven't yet equilibrized that heat. But that's good for us right now, but it's bad in the long term because it means that whatever we turn off everything right now, that energy is in the oceans, and the oceans are going to eventually equilibrize that. And a fraction of sea level rise that occurs right now is not from ice melting in Antarctica and Greenland, but actually the fact that it's a simple fact of physics that the coefficient of expansion, that water expands when it gets hotter. So a fraction of the 10 or 20 millimeters of average sea rise that's happened now is just simply from ocean heating. But if we turn everything off, that ocean heating is going to continue, and that because it takes centuries for that energy to equilibrize in the ocean and heat the whole thing up. And Greenland, which already is losing more ice than most models predicted, and could catastrophically lose that ice, because what happens when the water melts on the surface, it goes down below and basically provides a kind of lubricant for the ice to slide off into the ocean. If all that ice disappears in Greenland, you're talking about meters of sea level rise, which is devastating. Now, the first world, in some sense, can deal with it, although Florida is already, I was just reading, Florida, they're already mitigating it. There are places you can't rebuild your house in Florida right now because of sea level rise, okay? And it's going to get only worse. But the rich countries, New York can try and build a moat around it, okay? But Bangladesh or various countries in the South Pacific just can't. And that population, and those are dense, poor populations, and they've got to go somewhere. But here's something interesting. It's a tidbit that I was fascinated by in the podcast. One of the reasons to listen to it or watch it. So global sea levels will rise when the ice melts from Greenland, okay? But interestingly, when the ice melts off the Greenland ice sheet into the ocean, the sea level near Greenland will actually go down. Now, I could give you a quiz. Why would that happen? But I'm not going to do it. There's also you'll be pleased
go back
to know.
To my physics.
Yeah,
again.
no. Well, I would never have guessed it either. It's the gravitational attraction. There's so much mass on top of Greenland and ice that it attracts right now the water towards Greenland. When that ice is gone, that gravitational attraction goes away. So near Greenland, the water sea levels will actually go down. The physics of this is fascinating, if it wasn't, in some sense, terrifying at the same time.
Right.
Anyway.
What do you say to people that say that climate change isn't human-caused, that it's just a natural cycle?
Well, I say, it's nice to say that, but not only is there no evidence of it, I guess if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And the point is, it's not rocket science. You know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, as is methane and other things, and you know the energy coming in from the sun. You can do the energy flows. And you can say how much heat is being trapped by carbon dioxide. What are the predicted generic? I mean, climate modeling in detail is very complicated. But what's the energetics of energy in and energy out, and therefore energy stored? And you do that, and you find out the impacts of what's happening are completely consistent with what that simple prediction. Now you say, well, maybe that could be just totally wrong. But when a simple calculation that's of basic physics gives you something that generically agrees with what's happening, you should suspect that that's probably the case. And as I say, it's not what people used to say was, well, these models are uncertain. And there's still some people who, even some scientists who I've debated, who would argue that, well, the modeling of exactly what sea level rise, what temperature increase is going to occur are uncertain. And they are. Uncertainty is a key part of science, which is important because we can estimate the uncertainty. But it's not prediction in the future. It's the fact that it's already happening, that you can see sea level rise already happening. You can see ocean acidification happening because what happens is that when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, some of it gets dissolved in the ocean water as carbonic acid, making the ocean more acidic. And you can see the pH level in the ocean changing by exactly the amount you'd predict if the carbon dioxide level is increasing. It's just basic chemistry. And that, of course, is impacting on, and will impact on oceans 2.0, on ocean life. So these things are really happening now. And I think that's the more important aspect of this, is that sure, there's uncertainties, and whether in 2100 the temperature increase will be 5 degrees or 3 degrees or 10 degrees, which again doesn't sound like a lot, but 5 degrees is more than the temperature change from ice ages to the hottest areas we know. We are creating an Earth that has already, at the carbon levels in the atmosphere, that has not been seen for over 5 million years. I mean, it's Earth 2.0, and it's already that way right now. And the last little, you got me on a soapbox, but the last thing I'll say about this is, people used to say, well, we have, one of the arguments that certain people use in the United States is to say, well, yeah, this may be a problem, but we can't afford to deal with it right now. I mean, we've got other pressing financial problems. Now, of course, one of the responses is, cleaning up after hurricanes, it costs a lot more than preventing in some ways. And so money spent preventing problems usually is a lot less than cleaning up afterwards. Plus the economic opportunities that come from developing new technologies that address these problems is one thing. But it's more than that. It's that, so because every bit of carbon we add to the atmosphere now stays there, what we've added in all of human industrial activity is there already. And if we want to keep the level below a certain amount, and it used to be around below 400 parts per million, or now at 415 already, the problem is, you say, what is required? What kind of breaks or changes to the world economy do you need to do? Well, 10 years ago, to keep the levels down to the IPCC target level, you would have had to cut carbon 5% per year. But because in the intervening 10 years, in the inter-decade, we put in 60 billion tons of carbon each year, roughly, I think, into the atmosphere. Because we've been doing that, now to reach the same level, you'd have to cut it 9%. But if we don't do that, you see what happens is every year you continue to add that, the challenge to technology to keep things at the level you want at is much greater. So it's not, you can't push 20 years into the future and say, well, we'll deal with this problem 20 years in the future, because the problem will be a very different one 20 years in the future.
Are you hopeful? Are we going to figure this out?
It depends on the day. I think that I have great faith in technology to be able to address problems, and in scientists and creative scientists and engineers being able to address problems. So in that sense, I'm hopeful.
And the children.
And the children, yeah, to get back to your original question, which we deviated from, the fact that young people seem universally to be addressing this problem means that certainly there'll be a consensus, at least in the first world, that this problem has to be dealt with by people who will then be in political power and who will, in the interim, be able to vote. Gives me great faith. But at the same time, the negative part of my consciousness tells me that why I'm worrying more is humans' ability to govern, to think globally, deal with the socio-political problems that are going to result. I think technologically we can deal with it, but I just, if I look around the world now and I see what's happening in terms of xenophobia and denial and the ways that technology can impact on changing people's views in a way that can impact on democracy itself, I have severe concerns.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, it's one thing when, 40,000 people are trying to cross a border. It's another thing when 40 million people are leaving their country via boat because they can't survive.
Yeah, and you can exactly, and you can affect public opinion in two ways, and the way it will be affected is to make sure that the people that these people are viewed as threats, as they are being now. The simplest way, look, that manipulated Brexit, the idea that there's this horde of people from illegal immigration into Europe that are going to be in England, and then the England can't be England anymore. The most effective way to govern people is by making them afraid. It was, I think Goebbels who said in Nazi Germany that democracy or dictatorship doesn't matter. You want to make people do what you want them to do, make them afraid. And I think that's the effective way of dealing with things right now. And you make people afraid and they're willing to vote or act against their own self-interest because of that fear. And how can you overcome fear? Well, I'm an educator, so I'm biased, but it seems to me the only way ultimately is to give information and try and educate. And that's one of the reasons why I do some of the things I try and do, and is to try and open up and get people thinking about these problems, not necessarily believing me or any of the people I may have on, but get them interested enough to begin to research the problems. And that means, in the modern world, not going into your echo chamber, not going into your favorite sites on the internet where you get all your information, which may be wrong or biased, but we're willing to look broadly. And it means training young people, the same young people who are not buying the nonsense that's being thrown at them by the propaganda about climate change. Skepticism in young people is, to me, the greatest hope. And I grew up in the 60s, and so for me, I saw young people protesting the war, and it created, for me at least at the time, I thought a generation of people who would say, we're not going to buy this nonsense. We're not going to buy the lies, and I had great hope for the world as a result. But that hope was misplaced in some sense. But breeding skepticism in young people is very important, and then training them to be skeptical and to figure out how to gain information. Not in a world where education before used to be just sort of throwing things at kids in schools and amassing a certain amount of information, but that's useless because there's more information in the iPad you're holding, if it's an iPad, then you could get in all schools. There's more misinformation too. And what we have to train young people to do, because it's too late for the old people, is to be able to learn how to tell the wheat from the chaff in what they get from the internet. How to sift that information, how to check sources. That's the kind of training we need to do in schools. Of course, we need to teach them how to read and write and do mathematics, but beyond that, the kind of learning tools that'll be necessary to be a productive and viable adult voting human being in the rest of the 21st century will be very different than it was before. And if you don't have those tools, then you're much more easily manipulated by whoever is in power.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. You were recently on this island in the South Pacific called Malekula.
Oh, yeah.
And observing some of the geothermal activity. And I thought you made an observation that humans maybe are just a tiny blip of insignificance on the planet in the long run.
Yeah, well, I mean,
I get that in my ayahuasca ceremonies too sometimes.
Well, we are. I think the illusion that we have significance is part of our problem. I mean, obviously, it's part of the religious problem that somehow the humans have dominion over the earth is a real problem for some evangelicals, for some not. But I mean, the notion that it doesn't matter what we do, God's going to take care of us. So that's a myth that has to be dispensed with. But more importantly, recognize the humility that we are, in a cosmic sense, completely insignificant. I mean, that's what I've written about in my books. The cosmos doesn't care whether we're here or not. In fact, to some extent, it's trying to kill us all the time. But even in a human sense, the energetics, the long-term history of the Earth, humans, there's no doubt humans are the first species that have dramatically, globally affected the Earth. I don't think any other species has done that particularly. So, but we're still just a blip. And you go to a volcano and you see the energy and that is harnessed in the Earth, and you realize how literally insignificant you are as a human being is a very powerful thing. It shouldn't disturb you. It should realize how fortunate you are that you have the opportunity to think, to act, to enjoy. And so I'm always amazed that especially some religious people talk about how it would be nice if scientists were more humble. And I always think, well, what's more humble? Recognizing you're an insignificant cognitive being who has consciousness on a remote planet in the middle of nowhere in a random galaxy in the middle of a universe that doesn't care about us, or saying the universe was created so we could exist. I mean, which is more humble?
I think I understand the answer to that one.
Okay.
And while we're just finishing this up, what do you think of Greta Thunberg and what she's done?
I've been watching. I mean, I'm always skeptical, especially people who catch the media's attention, but she's really impressed me as a young person. I tweeted a small speech she said, just because, she was testifying before Congress, and one of these Congress people basically more or less said, why should we listen to the scientists on climate change? And she looked at him saying, what kind of stupid, this is a 16-year-old, and she said, why would we not listen to the scientists? I mean, it's an obvious question, but the fact that you need a 16-year-old to say it is remarkable, and she does it with such poise. I think she captured the imagination, and the fact that she's impacted, on this climate strike thing, I'm always a little wary of gimmicks, but the fact that it raises awareness is very good, and she is, as a young spokesperson, is remarkably powerful. Now, I don't know what group she has behind her and the rest. And I've seen lately reactions that do worry me. I mean, so I do events, and we're running educational events. We're taking a group to the Mekong to look at the one of the things the Origins Project Foundation is doing is running a trip with Richard Dawkins and a climate scientist, Richard Somerville, to the Mekong Delta in January, and there are still some berths available, so people should go and look. To look a number of things besides the culture of that region, but also it's an area that's going to be directly impacted by climate change in a large amount. And some people are saying, well, yes, but you shouldn't travel. There's all these people basically saying, and I was told that the Heathrow they were thinking about closing it or canceling flights a few days ago because some climate activists were going to be flying drones into Heathrow to try and limit that because they're objecting to planes, which of course do produce greenhouse gases. But to argue that we have to stop global travel to deal with this, I think is impractical at best. It's just unrealistic. We need people. You can have an impact and not have everyone take solar-powered boats around the world. We just can't sustain the global marketplace the way we do. And we can also design planes, of course, that use less fossil fuels. We can develop technologies that'll do that. Maybe even, although I'm skeptical, maybe even electric-powered planes at some point. But
still make the trips because the education is important.
Well, I think we can't. And not only that, I actually think for young people, the most important education they can get is to see another culture.
Right.
And so when the reaction that comes, and it was nice of her as maybe a publicity stunt, or maybe she really believes it, to take this solar-powered boat across the Atlantic Ocean to come to the United States. It was a demonstration that she could do that. But I don't want people to get the wrong idea that we have to. In fact, that's the biggest way to stop people from taking action. To say that they have to give up everything they have in order to fight the problem.
Right.
We can't do that.
That's the wrong attitude.
That's the wrong attitude completely. We have to be careful and rethink certain things. We should try, those people who can become vegetarians probably become vegetarians, because there's no doubt that meat industry produces a lot of climate change. If you can't become vegetarian, eat less meat. Sure, drive your car less, maybe. And one big thing, which is sort of the elephant in the room that's often not discussed, is the biggest contribution to pollution and climate change is population. And so think about the size of the family you want to have. And that's one less child, and I hate to put it this way, people are going to get angry and think I'm awful, but one less child that you have is one huge impact on reducing, because it's the integrated lifetime of that child and the carbon that they're going to produce, and besides the impact on resources and everything else. And so I think there are many positive ways to address the problem without giving up everything you have. And the people who are trying to get people to react are threatening. People like Trump are saying, well, these people are going to take away everything you have for this climate change thing. They're going to destroy the economy. And you know, and then there are people who have hyperbole on the other side. Al Gore, who's actually in London this week to speak at the same group I'm speaking to, the How To Academy. I'm going to talk on Thursday, and I think he's maybe talking today or tomorrow. But he's pointed out that this is an opportunity for people to make money. It's an opportunity to develop new technologies. And if viewed that way, and that's what Obama used to say as well, that addressing climate change is an opportunity to develop new technologies that will productively help countries move into the 21st century at the same time as doing good.
Yeah, and if it doesn't make economic sense, it's hard to get people to do it. You can't really shame them into it, right?
No, I mean, to some, yeah, you can't. I mean, you can shame people. Basically, look, I used to tell teachers, and I tell radio hosts and podcast people and salespeople the same thing, but I used to tell teachers, the biggest mistake any teacher makes is to assume their students are interested in what they have to say. But it's true of anyone. If you want to convince people to do something, no one's going to listen to me and talk. What I have to do is go to where they are, talk about something that they hold dear to themselves, and try and get them to think about it in those terms. And so, yeah, you can't shame someone, but you can get them to think about things and maybe convince themselves. So I think that you can do to some extent. But you're right, if people feel that their livelihood is threatened and the comfort and well-being of their children are threatened, they're not going to act. And I think what we have to convince people of, because it's true, is that if we don't act appropriately, the livelihood and well-being of their children will be affected. And that the fact that the children are recognizing that and saying, you are the ones who are leaving us this future. You won't have the future to deal with. We'll have to deal with it. And so you should be doing something now for your kids. That's probably the biggest problem in dealing with climate change, is it's a long-term problem, even though it has impacts now. Unlike, you know, for a long time, I was chairman of the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. We do the Doomsday Clock. And when I came in as that, we broadened it from just nuclear. The Doomsday Clock was about existential threats to humanity. Okay. And it was created by Oppenheimer and Einstein in 1947. I was very happy then to be the chair of it after all that time.
Because every year, Oppenheimer, after he was involved in the Manhattan Project,
after he was involved,
came back and said, this is bad.
Well, a lot of the scientists from the Manhattan Project came in and said, we have to explain to the world the dangers of nuclear weapons so that we don't have nuclear wars. And the Doomsday Clock was designed to be a symbol that would present how close to midnight we were based on nuclear tensions. And so for 10 or 12 years while I was doing it, we'd set the Doomsday Clock every year. But we expanded it to include other existential threats, one of which was climate change. Okay. But at the same time, it's apples and oranges. Nuclear weapons are a huge threat. They remain so today. And tomorrow, the world in many ways could be dramatically changed if there was a nuclear...
yeah, John McNamara always said that's how we're going to go.
Well, I don't know, I don't...
He just said it was one of the biggest
It's certainly the biggest, it is the biggest immediate existential threat. And the point is there are ways to go, let me just, as long as we're talking disasters, obviously a global thermonuclear war is, boom, world's over. Okay, even though we've reduced the number of thermonuclear weapons, we still have at least 5,000 in the United States, 5,000 in Russia. That's more than enough to do in the world. But forget that for the moment. And forget the fact that, by the way, a lot of them are still on trigger alert. There's no need, because we're not, we at this point still, we're not yet back in the Cold War. We don't need to do that anymore, but we do. And an accident, and we've come so hair-trigger close to accidents over the last 50 years.
Trigger alert means if one fire's there, I'm going to fire, and then they all go. Yeah, because
you don't have enough time to assess. Right. And so the chain of command, you want to read, there's two really chilling books to read. One is Command and Control, and Daniel Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers, has written a book called The Doomsday Machine. about his not just the time when he was working for the Rand Corporation and security, all of the near nuclear, not only nuclear threats, but when he discovered, for example, one of the myths is that it's only the president that can launch nuclear weapons. Well, that's a myth. And one of the other myths that many Americans think is that the United States has a no first use policy of nuclear weapons. It doesn't. It never said we won't be the first to use nuclear weapons. I mean, there are lots of scary things there. But one of the scary things was the realization that a distant nuclear war between, say, India and Pakistan, which might involve 200 nuclear weapons or 100, or recently, about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a physicist did a series of estimates of what would be the impact of a limited nuclear war. Obviously, India and Pakistan would be devastated, but a limited nuclear war with maybe 100 to 200 nuclear weapons exchanged between those two countries. It would produce a global impact on the climate that would probably kill 1 billion people, because it would produce global warming. Now, that's not, I mean, global cooling, now that's not the way we want to counter global warming, but the particulate material in the atmosphere would affect the global temperature in a way that would affect crops around the whole world for at least a decade. And so no country is an island. And I brought up those nuclear threats to point out that we haven't even dealt with those. But as hard as it is to deal with nuclear threats, dealing with climate change is harder because people keep thinking it's in the future, and the way people do risk analysis. And as a business person, you're familiar, people don't think about risks in a rational way. And the way people do risk analysis is such that if it's 50 years in the future, it's never worth dealing with it. And even if it's 10 years in the future, as far as people are concerned. And it is remarkable how people will be misplacing how they respond to risk. I mean, the simple example is that I do travel a lot, and I find it ridiculous the things I have to do to go through airports now because of people's concerns about terrorism on planes. Now, I understand it's a concern, but some guy tries to light a shoe on fire, and then people have to take off their shoes and go through these things. And I don't want to make it sound like I don't care about this, but let's just talk about it from a statistical statistical perspective. Let's say we lost 3 planes a year which is awful, okay, but compared to the number of people who die, say in mass shootings in the United States, it's nothing. But we won't act on it, but yet that threat and that fear is such because everyone flies, and they assume they're not going to be involved in a mass shooting, because they occur in pockets here or there. The kind of things people will respond to and not respond to is very irrational. Lots of people, Danny Kahneman and others, have written about this, and that our perceptions of how we assess risk and how we're going to take actions are certainly not rational from a probabilistic perspective.
Yeah. Can we talk about religion?
Anytime let's move from the sublime to the ridiculous. Okay.
You're known as the anti-religion guy. I mean, you made a movie about it with Dawkins.
Well,
you've had heated debates over the years with Islamists and Christians. Yeah. And has your views on any of that changed in the last 2 years?
Well, I don't know if it's changed. I used to describe myself as not an atheist, but in deference to my late friend Christopher Hitchens, as an anti-theist, because that's how he described himself.
You knew him too. You know everybody, Lawrence.
Yeah. I knew. It's a sad loss for the world, but I knew Christopher. He was a wonderful man. So he said he was an anti-theist, I think, and I like that term because religion poisons everything, as he used to say. But I kind of evolved to be an apatheist, and in the sense that people have the illusion that this question of is there a God or could God have created the universe is some pressing issue that physicists think about. But they don't. I've been a physicist for 50 years almost, and I've never heard it mentioned in a physics meeting. God is irrelevant because we know how the world, you don't need to think about God to try and figure out how the world works, because as far as we can see, the natural effects have natural causes, and at least as far as we understand, we've never needed to invoke any tooth fairies, any magic, any supernatural stuff. And now some people say, well, how do you know? We don't know, but we'll never know unless we keep trying. We haven't hit a roadblock yet that we haven't been able to get past. And so one of the things I like to remind people of is that this issue of God, when it comes to understanding how the world works, is irrelevant. Now, what is true is that religion, unfortunately, does poison everything. I'm not saying that, look, there are people who do good things because they're religious, or at least that resonates with their character, and they take some parts of Scripture and use that and try and live a good life. They certainly don't take all parts of Scripture. That's everyone in England, where we are now. The Richard Dawkins Foundation, maybe 15 years ago, I forget now, so they took the census in England, and it was a big development that at that time only 50% of adults declared themselves members of the Church of England. Maybe it was 55, but it was a number that surprised people for being so low. And what Dawkins et al. Did was take that set who declared themselves to be members of the Church of England, Christians, and said, why are you a Christian? Do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe in transubstantiation? Do you believe in this? Do you believe in that? Blah, blah. And the answer was no, 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 no. And the final question is, why do you think you're a Christian? And the answer was, I like to think of myself as a good person, because religion has appropriated morality. And the point is that, so when you talk about religion, there is no such thing as religion per se. Take Christianity. Everyone's Christianity is different. And almost everyone who adopts some of the world's organized religions has appropriated some things. What they do is they take the things they like and they don't take things they don't like. I mean, one of the most immoral books you could ever want to read is the Old Testament and the Bible. I mean, stoning your children because they disobey you. I mean, it's just, yet people just say, well, that I'm not listening to that part. I like this part. And except for the fundamentalists, who in some sense you could, I suppose, have some respect for, because they say either the whole thing's true or none of it. I take the none of it. But so people utilize religion as a shield for the good things they do. But what the negative aspects of religion, besides the us versus them thing, besides the fact that in the extreme cases, of course, it produces violence and hatred, obvious, not just in extremist fundamentalist Islam, but the same thing in Christianity and in Judaism too. And there's a long history in all of those religions. But it's also the fact that it stops thinking. If you believe you know the truth without even asking questions, then you don't think. And for me, that's the biggest threat to being human, is questioning. And one of the greatest developments that came from the Unbelievers for me that I didn't expect, I mean, I knew about extremists and all that, were the people who wrote to us after that movie came out, or one of my books, or Richard's books, and I get these people saying, I'm just so glad to see I'm not alone, first of all. I live in a small town in the south of the United States, and I know that I've just questioned whether God exists. Not even, I just have that question. And I'm afraid to talk about it. And I know that if my parents or my neighbors or my teachers, I will be shunned. And I feel alone, and I feel like a bad person for asking those questions. And to realize that I'm not a bad person for asking those questions has liberated it for me. And for me, that's the greatest impact that movie had, and some of my books have had. Just that subtle fact that people feel they're not allowed to ask questions is terrible. And the social pressures that organized religion imposes, shunning people, excluding them for potentially deviating from the flock. And what worries me more now is that's gone beyond religion. We're seeing that in the internet. That people have a religious fervor about everything, and so they will shun people, and you can't even ask the question. If you ask a question which is at all provocative but goes against the grain, now you get removed. It's really amazing.
See, it's your fault because I couldn't follow religion, so now I'm a flat earther.
Yeah, exactly.
It's Lawrence Krauss's fault.
Yeah.
But that is happening, right? You're getting these pockets of believers. They want to belong to something. They have a thing.
Whether it's flat earthers or there's a whole slew of things. And it's the effective ability of the internet to cause for people to make claims that influence others and cause them to either shun or do other things to other people, that is of great concern. It's a kind of religiosity. And the religiosity doesn't just exist, and let me make it clear, it sounds like a holier than thou argument. It's not just religious people who have a religiosity. There are atheists who have a religiosity. There are people...
Some say scientists too.
Of course. Well, scientists are people, which is a secret that we have to remind people of. It's not well known that scientists are people. And the great thing about science is it overcomes the natural inclination of scientists to have biases. The process overcomes the people doing it.
Right.
That's the great thing about science. So scientists are have no monopoly on rationality in that sense. And what science tries to teach us is always to question ourselves, because we're the easiest people to fool. But
is that a quote from Richard Feynman?
What was that?
Is that a quote
yeah,
from
that's
Richard
a quote
Feynman?
Richard Feynman. Exactly, Richard
Nice.
Feynman. But there's a religiosity. Don't accept evolution just because I say it happened. I mean, the point is, what you really need to do is question things and think. And you can't be an expert in everything, but you can try and assess who's reliable and who isn't. And so the religiosity of saying, for me, God is in the one end is an excuse to say, I don't want to think about it. I just stop thinking. And in fact, as Ricky Gervais, who was on our program, has said many times, in fact, in the Unbelievers said it, God works in mysterious ways. What's that mean? It means I can't think, I don't want to think, right? God works in mysterious ways. What it means is I can't understand it. I'm not going to think about it. I'll just say God did it. And for me, at least, that's an anathema, that we have evolved a consciousness and ability to question and think, and it's one of the things that makes being human worth being human. The joys and tragedies of being human are involved in the fact that we can assess our place, assess ourselves, find out that maybe we're not all that we thought we should be or can be, and try and improve. Or it's the whole human condition, and to give that up is to give up being human, and that's to some extent what religion does.
Do you think 2,000 years from now there will be religion?
I used to think in the 1960s we wouldn't be religious now. So, what is true is that religion meets some human needs.
Definitely.
And community needs for the tribe, needs to feel purpose. We undoubtedly, evolutionarily, have a teleology, as people would say. We need to find purpose in things. And it's not, I've talked about this before, but it's not me, but there are obviously evolutionary reasons for that. If you're in the savannah in Africa and the trees are rustling, you can assume there's nothing behind to do with it, or you can assume there's some purpose, like that maybe there's a lion. And the people who assumed there was nothing there, they never lived long enough to procreate. And so looking for purpose is definitely something that we're hardwired to do by our evolutionary background. But also feeling community, and a natural kind of xenophobia. My Origins project once ran a big meeting on xenophobia. Us versus them has helped in tribes, and you can see it in chimpanzees, and so there's lots of things religion does that meet basic human needs. And
Gives
so
you
the question
some morality as well that's kind of pre-written.
Religion, as I say, has usurped morality.
Right.
I think the argument that religion is responsible for morality is just ludicrous.
But the people in that response for the Church of England said, I want to be a good person.
Yeah, that's because the church has done such a great job. We have 2,000 years of great press agents to convince people that if they don't accept that, they are immoral. In fact, if you're an atheist, you're immoral. There's Julia Sweeney, who's another friend of mine. She was in Saturday Night Live, but she's a well-known atheist too. But she once said, when she first came out to her mother and said she was an atheist, her mother said, "Oh my God, I can see you not believing in God, but an atheist." Because in the United States, there was a survey done, and the people who were basically most distrusted, below rapist, was atheists. It has a connotation that if you just say, "I'm not willing to believe in this invented deity," or "I'm not willing to accept the evidence enough to believe in it," even if it's that gentle, you are labeled. Now you're labeled to be militant, whatever that means, if you're open enough to speak about it, and that's sad. So but but religion, creates some rules. It certainly did in early tribes, the Ten Commandments, et cetera, and some of them make sense, some of them don't. So the question is, you can't just get rid of religion, nor is it, for many people, it's a source of great comfort. The idea that there may be something after their death. Death is a universal human trauma. And so it provides comfort. And so the idea is not to get rid of these things wholesale, but are there other ways that we could meet fundamental human needs like that without inventing fake stories that give us false comfort or false distrust or inhibit our willingness to take actions on things we should take actions of? And so that seems to me the question. Can you have this kind of social organizations that are much more healthy than religious organizations of? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's where we should be striving.
Okay.
And I don't make predictions for something as short as 2,000 years in the future. I like to make predictions for 2 trillion years in the future, because then I'm sure no one will be around to check them.
And what do you make of the flat earthers? What do you see when you see that happening?
I'm shocked in the 21st century by so much. I got a call recently from a French journalist, because there was a meeting of people in North Carolina, I think it was, 200 people, PhDs, okay, flat earthers. And the journalist asked me the question is, how do you know the earth isn't flat? What? And so I like to kind of think of new ways all the time to try and counter that, like I used to do for young earthers, because they're all used to saying, oh, radioactivity doesn't work. So I'd come up with another thing that would show them that the earth had to be more than 6,000 years old.
Okay.
And the fact that people, I'm not sure whether some of them don't say it just to get notoriety, but I think it is what you said it is. It's a reaction. It's a reaction to distrust of the scientific community, to distrust of what they may view as the military-industrial complex. That drives them to such a ludicrous conclusion so that they can say, look, I don't trust NASA, I don't trust this, I don't trust that. And to prove that I'm a skeptic, I don't trust anything, including the evidence of all evidence that we have that the earth is round. I'm going to show that I'm the ultimate skeptic. So I think it's more a willingness to believe crazy things because of distrust and fear. And to bring it back around, I think that's why a fair fraction of older people voted for Brexit.
Because of the distrust.
The distrust.
Yeah, well, they don't trust people in London. That's what a lot of it is.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And they don't trust the elites, and it's played off. Trump does that. Don't trust the elites, don't trust the scientists, don't trust the people who may give you information because they're not on your side. And that's what populist demagogues have been doing for a long time, is building off that fear and driving people to illogical conclusions because of distrust and fear. It's always the same kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's happening in the world of physics? Exciting stuff?
Well, yeah. One of the new aspects of the podcast is we have a new segment called Science Matters. I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about it because I'm excited about it.
You're a great promoter, man. I'm telling you.
I haven't promoted much in my life about things like that, but I'm very excited by what we're able to do. And it's something that's fun for me. It's a segment called Science Matters, where I take science stories that are in the news or maybe should be in the news and actually talk about them for 10 minutes instead of 30-second sound bites, to try and get people to look at them and understand them, or at least learn enough that they're interested enough to think about them, or what maybe some things that are in the news that are nonsense. So there's lots of amazing every day there's amazing scientific discoveries because of new tools. For me, our ability to look at the universe in gravitational waves and now is changing our ability to see things that we couldn't see on promoting on Thursday when I give a talk at the How To Academy here. It's going to be on black holes because we've learned an incredible amount. But the most recent Science Matters podcast had three examples of exciting things. One is new developments in understanding how life evolved. We know that, of course, how, since Darwin, how the diversity of life has occurred on Earth by evolution. That's no doubt about it. We understand it, we measured it, we see it. But we still don't know the origin of life. And Darwin thought we'd never learn about the origin of life, but that's because he was living in the 1850s, and we're coming incredibly close to understanding how chemistry can turn into biology. And that, by the way, is important because there's a lot of money that NASA spends on what's called astrobiology, looking for life. And we've made great discoveries of thousands of planets. Until 20 years ago, we knew of 9. I still call Pluto a planet. But now we know around something that many of us astrophysicists already accepted because of the modeling, that most stars have planetary systems around it. What we've learned, as we always learn when we look out and see new things, is that we're surprised, is that there are planetary systems that we thought were physically impossible that exist. We used to think the gas giants had to be in the outer part of solar systems and the rocky planets inside, but we see the opposite in almost anything that can happen does happen out there, which means it's a lot more exciting out there than you imagined. But when people try and say, well, what's the possibility of life out there? One of the key questions that allows us to address that, which we don't have the answer to yet, is how did life evolve on Earth?
Right.
So when you hear about a habitable planet, be skeptical. Maybe there's water on it, but even then it's not clear. For example, just to give you an example. So there's a Goldilocks zone around stars, a region where the temperature of the planet is enough for liquid water, if it exists, to be liquid, not ice or gas. Well, you might argue that the Earth is in a habitable zone, and we are. But even the Earth, if you look at the history of the Earth, because of the distribution of continents in the Earth, 600 to 800 million years ago, the whole Earth froze over solid. It was ice. And then how that dynamics of how that formed, actually Dan Schrag, who we had on the program I talked to you about climate change, was one of the people who first explored that snowball Earth hypothesis. At the time it was a hypothesis, now there's a great deal of evidence. So even if you're in the habitable zone, if things aren't just right, the whole thing can be frozen. So you have to take that with a great degree of salt. But even further, before we can make realistic estimates of what life there is in the universe, it would be nice to understand what conditions resulted in life on Earth and how it resulted. Because DNA and RNA, even if we lived in an RNA world before a DNA world, RNA is an incredibly complicated molecule. How do we go from no life to life?
Right, from chemicals to biology.
And what is amazing, and a lot of work is being done in the UK on this, by the way, in laboratories in Cambridge and elsewhere, we're getting closer and closer, I think, to seeing at least the conditions and the requirements to have natural chemistry produce complex organic materials and maybe self-replicating materials. In this podcast, I just showed how a big new development, just understanding how the protocells might form. Because to have living systems, they have to be protected from the outside world. You have to have a cell which allows the chemistry to be not disturbed from the outside. And I'll just give you a simple example because I did it on the program. So there are these things called fatty acids, and they look like tadpoles with a big head and a tail. And it turns out the big head likes water. The chemistry of it is it wants to be attracted to H2O. The tail is repelled by it, okay? So what happens if you have a bunch of them? They line up so the heads are facing the water and the tails are inside. What does that do? It produces a circle or a sphere that the inside is protected from the outside. Great. Could fatty acids be a natural precursor to cells? Yes, but there was a well-known problem. If you put them in salt water or magnesium or other things, they're no longer stable. And of course, the early oceans had salt water, and so how could you have this? What some young researcher just discovered with her supervisor, they were in Washington, was magical, at least magical to me and magical to them, is that they were playing around and they said, well, if you have amino acids, which are the basis of proteins that drive human biology, and amino acids, by the way, are prevalent throughout the cosmos. They occur naturally in comets and asteroids and everything else. But if you put amino acids at the same time as you have these fatty acids, what you discover is that if you fill up this sphere with amino acids, it's stable. So here is the thing. So suddenly if you have the building blocks of proteins, they make the thing that might form a cell stable. So it's just remarkable. It means that naturally you could form a system that has all of the constituents that later on you'd want to have for life, and it's only stable if they're all there. What a wonderful development. Now, we don't know how it actually happened, but I thought it would be fun to talk about, and it's the kind of thing I could talk about with a little diagram behind me that was understandable. There's another thing I talked about in the episode, which is a claimed controversy that I was reading the papers. Oh, cosmology is breaking down. I always read this every few weeks. Some discovery means everything we know is wrong, which of course is not true. But it's a weird controversy. We try and measure the expansion of the universe different ways, and we come up with different numbers, measurably different numbers. Now, there's two possibilities. Either the measurements are wrong, or there's something fundamentally wrong with our picture in cosmology. And a number of distinguished astronomers are saying that the numbers are different enough that we have to rechange everything we think about how the universe evolved from early times to now. And so I wanted to explore that in a way that would actually give the data to the public to say, is this a controversy? I don't happen to think it is as bad as some, but I wanted to show the data, explain what it implied. And so I did that. And the last thing, which is very exciting from a technological and business perspective, is quantum computing and quantum teleportation and all. And why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because those developments will change the way we do business. Because, for example, your credit card works because you can encode a key and so that the bank knows it's you and someone else doesn't take money out of your bank account. And so encryption and key coding is an incredible part of what makes the bank system stable. And the way it's encoded is what are called large prime numbers. It turns out that if you take a large number, every number can be described as the product of primes. But if you take a large enough number, right now it would take any computer longer than the history of the universe to determine what the primes are that make up that number. So banks have big, large numbers that they've created by the multiplication of primes, and they know what those prime numbers are, and they use that as a code, and so you can't break that code. But one of the things that was realized is that quantum computers, which can compute differently, and if you want to talk about them, we can. I certainly did in the podcast, but they will allow you, in principle, to do kind of calculations that would allow you to figure out the prime factors of a large number in a finite time. And if you had a quantum computer, therefore, you could break the codes that all banks are using, and that would cause a problem. Okay, so that's why national security agencies and others are working on quantum computers. But at the same time, while there's a problem, there's a neat opportunity. Quantum mechanics also not allowed, in principle, quantum computers, but something called quantum teleportation, where I can basically quantum mechanically reproduce the quantum state of one system very far away instantaneously. And we don't need to go into that now. Again, I tried to on my program. But that's fascinating, and it's a wonderful bit of technology, and it's been shown. People have now done in China and other places have done quantum teleportation from here to satellites, okay? But what that does is if you can do that quantum mechanically, you can actually you can encode things so that anyone who's measuring something here can see if there was an eavesdropper listening in between the time the signal was created and the time the signal was received. And that would allow you to see if anyone was eavesdropping and breaking your codes. So what I wanted to point out is that the world of the 21st century may depend on quantum mechanics in ways that it hasn't yet. And at the level of the sort of interface between forefront physics and technology, quantum mechanics is the place to be. And every day there are new discoveries that are fascinating. And the quantum world is crazy, but it's fascinating, and it's not just obscure. It's not something that's just the domain of people like me. And, you know, speaking of flat earthers, I mean, you depend on quantum mechanics every day. My phone wouldn't work if we didn't have semiconductors and use the properties of quantum mechanics. So these developments from quantum computing to understanding the universe are not esoteric. They help us understand our place in the universe, and they're also, I think, fascinating. And people can maybe not understand the details, not the mathematical details, but people can appreciate the context. And that's why I think it's important to talk about science in the news, because pretty well every aspect of our modern society in some way or another depends upon science. And too often we just think science is a black box and we shouldn't talk about it in the news or in the media or in movies or in fun discussions. But I think people are fascinated by it, and they can appreciate it, and it will impact on their lives, which is because, getting back to climate change, basic aspects of climate change are understandable and should be understood by every literate person in a society, so that we can make appropriate democratic judgments about how we're going to act as a society.
And why is science treated that way? I mean, you and I both went to MIT, and when we were kids, I don't know about you, but I was the science geek. I was the science fair.
Sure.
I was programming computers, which meant I didn't do music and I didn't do sports. And then, I mean, even at MIT, there's not a lot of other things to do there besides science. And
well, you overcame that. You clearly done sports.
Yeah, that's true. But you know, why is it
well,
kind of
I
pushed
think
over here?
I mean, look, I'm not the first one to think about this either, right? There's lots of scientists are responsible for part of this. Keeping it a club, making it seem like only certain people can understand things, gives you a kind of power.
Right, which was the history of science.
Yeah, and scientists could do that, and partly physicists are the worst of the lot in a sense, because they held the key to the atomic bomb, right? The Manhattan Project, and that meant huge government dollars going into physics research, because physicists could produce things like bombs, and so you could just keep feeding from the trough without making any attempt to explain what you're doing. Eventually that stopped, you know, and physicists began to realize that in order to get funding for large projects, we actually have to explain why we're doing what we're doing. So I think scientists are part of the problem, but I think our intellectual evolution, at least in the United States, is part of the problem. I taught at Yale for a long time, and Yale I like to think of as a glorified liberal arts college when I was there. I mean, there's great science that's being done there, but I can tell you that most students were proud that they never went up to Science Hill or took a class or had to waste their time from, you know, moving away from English or literature or history to dirty their hands in science. Much more also that they just didn't, you know, they just couldn't do it, right? And of course they could do it, okay? But the notion came that you could be an intellectual and an educated person, and it's okay if you just couldn't do science. In fact, it's almost a badge of honor to be an intellectual. Say, well, my brain doesn't work that way.
I'm no good at math.
Yeah, and of course, all those students at Yale could have. For a while, we tried to introduce where they all had to take calculus, and eventually it didn't happen because the math department didn't want to teach it. But all those students could do it, okay? But it was a badge of honor to say, well, you know, my mind doesn't work that way. I'm artistic. That's a recent development. It didn't used to be that way, you know, 100 years ago, where to be an educated gentleman in England, or say, you know, maybe 150 years ago, you used to have to at least have a cocktail party knowledge of science, okay? You also maybe had to know Latin and Greek, other things that have gone by the wayside. But I think for me, as much as we bemoan the teaching of science in schools, which is a real problem, I also view that the intellectual elites are part of the problem, because even those people who are interested in ideas somehow can think that that being scientifically illiterate doesn't make you illiterate. But in a modern world, it should. Yeah. And we teach science. We also teach science. We push people away from science early on. In the United States, in the middle school level, back when I last looked at this, which is again a decade or so when I was writing about it, well over 80 to 90% of middle school science teachers had no background in science. They were teaching science. What did that mean? That meant they were uncomfortable teaching. And I saw it when my daughter was young. Even in grade 2 or 3, when she'd go in and you know, what are you learning in science? Well, it's bright during the day and dark at night. You know what I mean? But her teacher when she was doing science, I could see that she felt uncomfortable doing that. What message does that send to the little kids? Okay, but then we also, I think a big part of the problem is, and we've tried to change that in various school systems, is the order of teaching science. In high schools, you tend to teach biology first, then chemistry, then physics. And since it's now all electives, it means people never get to physics, a lot of them, okay? Why do they do that? Part of the argument is that biology is natural. It's easier to people to picture. It's living systems. It's something you more comfortable with. There's less math. But the problem is that what it means is, and this is the reason I probably didn't become a doctor, because biology was taught when I was going to high school, dissecting a frog and memorizing the parts of a frog. It means rote memorization. The problem is, What's at the root of biology? It's chemistry. What's at the root of chemistry? It's physics. So if you, instead of taking the right order, learning some physics, learning about energy, which then becomes important for chemistry, which then becomes important, well, you understand these are processes. They're not things you memorize and say, yeah, someone told me this is the way it is, but I can understand how it is the way it is. You don't get that because you've learned it ass backwards. And so I think we need to understand that you know, we need to teach people the scientific process, not the results of science, but the process of skeptical inquiry, testing, retesting, all of those things that make science worthwhile are vitally important for the public to make them responsible adults in a pseudo-democratic society.
Yeah, and in the misinformation society and the too much information society, which didn't exist 20 years ago.
Yeah, so it produces this incredible challenge. You have people who many of whom are not trained to deal with the situation even before that, and are therefore open prey to a misinformation society right now. And I don't want to sound like, again, we're all prey to it. We all are subject to nonsense, and we all have biases and beliefs that are ridiculous. But what we have to do is to be trained to question the question.
Yeah, the scientific method has served me well. And sometimes I'll bump into people that just didn't have a training with it. I mean, honestly, a Based in Science Fair project is enough to get you the scientific method. I have a problem, I have a hypothesis, I run my tests, and I find out what the solution. It's not necessarily what my hypothesis was. That's okay.
That's great.
And then we give the truth, and then we try to come up with a conclusion. Like, that's like something...
If that's what you get out of a science fair project, it's great. I'm too worried often nowadays, so many parents are involved in science group practices. What you try and get is pretty pictures and pretty...
Yeah,
but if you can get that...
But that's what I remember as a kid, and it also seems so basic, but I guess it wasn't basic.
Well, I think it should be, and it's all... I mean, it's also fun. Although one of my crew was just reminding me that at one of our events, Richard Dawkins said, "Fun is overrated," but which is so typical for Richard. But what I mean is, it's not as if science is just fun. It's also hard work, but it is fun. The aha experience that you've had, and everyone's had at some point in their life, is orgasmic. It is thrilling to discover that the world behaves differently than you thought, or to understand something basic behind something that you never questioned. You know, why do planes fly? Why is the sky blue? And so that primal enjoyment is something we need to enforce more. And you know, there's a realization I had, which I should have had years before. I had just done a science movie, and I was you know, in a movie. It's a wonderful movie called The Farthest. I was just one of the talking heads in it, about the Voyager program. It was produced by a wonderful Irish director, in fact. And the opening was in Ireland, and I was there. And I was talking to a young person, and it suddenly hit me. Again, maybe this is obvious to everyone, but to me it wasn't till that moment, that we should realize that every time a young person learns something new, for them it's the first time in the history of the world that's been understood. It's not repeating what's already known, it's discovery. The act of learning is discovery, and gosh, we should be teaching that. We should make people realize and appreciate that they are discovering the world. They're not rediscovering the world, they are discovering it because it's the first time for them. And that act, I do think we're hardwired. We're hardwired to solve puzzles. There's lots of positive things as well as the negative things we're hardwired to do. It's pleasing for people to solve puzzles. Again, you cannot, the evolutionary basis for that is kind of obvious. And so let's play off the things that really are gratifying, as well as trying to avoid the things that aren't. And so whether you call it science or not, and that's why I wrote the physics of Star Trek the first time maybe, a lot of people are interested in science. It's just they don't know what science they're interested in. So if I, as I used to say years ago, if I went to a party and I was, you know, people asked me what I did, I'd say, you know, I'm a physicist, and they go, well, how about those Yankees, you know? And then, but if you talk about time travel or warp drive or something that doesn't intimidate people, and then there are lots of questions, and that's why black holes are so great, because everyone's, you know, it's a great sexy term. Then people realize, they don't realize that those are scientific questions, and it's interesting them, and you can have a discussion, and people ask lots of questions. And so labeling something as science sometimes is another way of turning people off.
Yeah.
And that's why I try to get involved in movies and other things, because there should be a continuity of intellectual discovery and enjoyment And science is just one part of it, as is music and art and everything else.
You once said that teaching's about seduction.
Yes,
That's
I did.
been kind of the story of your professional life. Like it's the reason you have Johnny Depp on the stage. It's the reason you make movies with Dawkins, because you're trying to engage with people.
You're trying to engage. And by seduction, I mean the good aspect. Namely, what I said before, if I want you to be engaged, I have to ask, what are you interested in? Not what am I interested in, but what's going to hook you in enough to listen? And we all do it. And so the act of selling, teaching, anything is seduction in that sense. And that's why it's worthwhile having a discussion about weird aspects of the way the brain works with Johnny Depp. Why? Because people want to see Johnny Depp. But then we can have a discussion about creativity and madness and in an open way and get people thinking about it. Or as I say, a movie with a great soundtrack with Richard Dawkins or any of the other things we try and do. They may seem sometimes like artificial hooks, but if people are more interested in the personalities and in the modern world they are, then I love the fact that, and one of the reasons why I decided to do this podcast is that I can have people like him or Ricky Gervais on, and then Noam Chomsky on, and I mean one of the first podcasts we had in the studio together, although we did separate podcasts, we had Noam Chomsky and Penn Jillette, the magician, and I had them in the studio together, and we even did a little bonus of 15 minutes together, and I thought, how are we going to do this? And the fact, those are two people I never would have thought would be in the same room. And what I love about it, and by the way, that you can see on YouTube for free, that clip, is that in that 15 minutes, it ends with a joke. And who tells a joke? It's Noam Chomsky. It's the first time I've ever seen him tell a joke on that. And so, but anyway, I love the juxtaposition that you don't need to label people. We all label each other, but that cultured people can be interested in science. And of course it's accepted and maybe expected that scientists should be, although some people say those nerds don't know anything, okay? But still, to be accepted socially, scientists, have to know about current movies or music, and it's something we want to do. And so being culturally aware for a scientist is kind of a badge of honor. But for some reason, being scientifically aware for a cultural icon isn't.
Right.
And there should be no difference. There should be no difference. And interestingly enough, I remember I was in India, and I was in an event with the president of India. And what was that event? That was when the president of India was answering physics questions from high school students. Right? At the time, George Bush, W. Bush, was president of the United States, and I just thought the contrast was too much not to be recognized.
You don't like any American presidents.
Oh, look, I suspect. I mean, being a politician is automatically limits you. I'm disappointed in many ways about what Obama wasn't able to do, but I certainly admired many aspects of what he was trying to do. So it's not that I don't like any American presidents. I just think the buffoon that we have now is an embarrassment to the world.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
No, it's more than just an embarrassment. It's a danger when you have this populist demagogue who has no interest in anything but himself and no knowledge of anything, literally does not want to understand anything, just uses people to be able to exploit and see himself more on TV. It's a danger to the world.
And shuns the science. That's what
not just shuns the science. I guess shuns it. Of course he shuns the science, but it's just discards it if necessary. I mean, all things are means to an end, and in his end, it's just himself. And he's very effective at distracting. That's what Noam actually talked about in our podcast. One of the things is what Trump does so effectively is distract from the important issues, and the newspapers. And I'm unfortunately just incredibly disappointed with journalism, because all the economic problems that newspapers are having and cable channels is this competition, because of the internet and other things, is to get clicks or to get watchers. And that means they have to look for clickbait or some salacious stories that will get viewers. And Trump is a wonderful salacious story, and focusing on his faux pas or his stupid statements or anything else distracts from climate change, distracts from all the infrastructure needs in the United States, from real immigration issues. So what Trump effectively has done is monopolize the news and distract not just government from taking any action, which has happened, but the public from being even interested in this, because the newspapers and TV focus on just this ridiculous man and what is he going to do next.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, and then the only last thing that the scientific method gave me was just the numbers. You know, it wasn't my opinion, it wasn't showmanship. It was always back to the numbers, and it was.
And ultimately, it's numbers. You know, ultimately, I mean, there's mathematical reasoning, and again, most people, but we can all reason. I mean, you don't have. First of all, what people don't realize is you don't have to be a mathematical wizard to be a great scientist. I have a number of colleagues of mine who have won Nobel Prizes in physics who were not the best in their class in mathematics. I mean, I've had a lot of kids write me and say, you know, I'm fascinated by this stuff, but I'm not the best. Mathematics-wise, I'm just not the best, and I feel like I shouldn't go into this. So you don't need to be a math. You have to be willing to work hard enough to be able to master enough to be able to do it. But it takes all types to be a scientist, pictorial types, creative thinking, all sorts of things. But also we have this notion that it's okay to be enumerate, and people really have the ability, if you spend a little bit of time, to just teach people how to do estimates. It's not beyond, it's not a mystery. We accept that people are enumerate, but they don't have to be. And I'm sure you've had this experience, but now, of course, because of calculators, and now that's old, but you know, I go into a grocery store, and you know, when I buy something that's, you know, and I'm estimating, you know, it's going to be about $15, and the bill comes to $150, I say, I think there's something wrong with your calculation. The person says, can't, the calculator, you know, but of course what they're doing is they plus something wrong in the calculator. You can simply estimate basic things that people don't even do. Okay, so I mean, for me, I have fun because I try and beat the adding machine in the grocery store to guess what the total is, because I like numbers. But you don't have to just do that. You can work with numbers in a basic way, and we accept enumeracy in a way that we don't accept illiteracy.
You're right, and we shouldn't. Are you going to teach again?
Well, I'm not sure, actually. I'm not sure. I mean, I retired this last year, on my 65th birthday, and I still may be teaching at the New College of Humanities, and I like to lecture at universities around the world. I think in terms of teaching classes, probably on a regular basis, probably not. I basically said, okay, I've done that for 40 years now, and is there a different way of teaching? And that's what I was telling you before we began the program. To some extent, the podcast was an idea of teaching in a different way. I was limited by having a day job. There are many things I could do, and I tried to juggle, and I've always tried to balance my research and teaching, and also with public things and writing in a way that both pleased me and I felt was useful. But there are a lot of things I couldn't do, and I said, because I've got responsibilities. I have a institute I'm running at the university, and I have my teaching at the university, and my graduate students to supervise. And so I've given up some of that, and I'm going to try other things. So that's part of the reason I'm doing what I'm doing now.
You've always been teaching in different ways.
Well,
though.
Exactly. I mean, I started teaching at a science museum when I was a kid. And that, by the way, was probably the best training. It was like vaudeville in a sense, you know, because I would do 10 shows a day of with Van de Graaff machines, and you know, and what I learned as a kid was to hone what I was talking about, because again, I made the mistake of assuming initially that people were interested in what I had to say, and then I learned that they weren't, and what things would get people interested. So it was a wonderful training as a young person to think about ways to deal with the public. So yeah, but I'm a teacher, and I'll always be in that sense, and hopefully always also a student. That's the more important thing, is to always be a student.
Always be a student, yeah.
But you know, working at a university is something I'm in many ways been there, done that.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on the issue, or final thoughts, or anything about leaving?
Well, I think that the point is, I think I'm worried about university campuses in the United States and elsewhere because of political correctness, and the point is that when it comes to higher education and education in general, nothing should be sacred. Everything should be open to discussion, debate. That's the point of education. And and when I used to say that one of the purposes of science, okay, is to confront our beliefs, okay, because our misbeliefs, and in some sense is to not offend so much, but confront, okay, provoke. And when it comes to science, when it comes to social sciences, when it comes to history, if our campuses turn into bastions of political correctness, on the right or the left, where you do not want to hear from people you disagree with, then education ends. The purpose should be to hear the things, the ideas that you don't like, that you don't accept, and debate them, because that's what learning's all about. And so I guess I'm worried about trends in higher education where we're seeing that students and others somehow feel that they should never have to confront an idea that offends them or disturbs them in any way, because learning ends there.
Yeah, it's a strange time right now, you know.
Yeah, it really is, and I see it in colleagues. They're friends of mine who Jonathan Haidt wrote a book with a colleague of his called The Coddling of the American Mind, where he was saying, I was just with him in New York a few months ago, in the book, and he was at a public event I was at, saying that he and others, but he in particular, taught at NYU, had changed the content of certain of his lectures because he knew that there would be objection, that students would object and he could be fired. The things he would have talked about 10 or 15 years ago. But students would now object enough in an organized way to, shame him if necessary or whatever, by pointing out this person is talking about something that's racist, or this person is talking about something. And I just think we have to ask ourselves the question, we have to really reevaluate that. When teachers feel they cannot teach, the extreme version of that was last week, I was going to tweet about it, in Pakistan. A liberal arts teacher was beloved, was killed because someone heard that he was criticizing the Quran, okay, and Islam. It turns out he wasn't. But I mean, there's the death penalty for the person. And people beloved him because he was actually talked about ideas and provoked people. The kind of teacher you would have loved in high school, right, is someone who provoked you and got you to come out of your shell. Well, if of course, and the extreme of it is not being able to talk about issues that might offend extremist Islam in Pakistan, but I'm worried about that in the United States. I was just talking to Ian McEwan, who I'd read in his new book, which is coming out this week, called Cockroach, which everyone should get, for Ian and others. It's about Brexit. I'll warn you, but it was one amazing statement that in an open society, all things are allowed except for that which is explicitly forbidden. Whereas in a totalitarian society, all things are forbidden unless they're sanctioned by the state. Very interesting idea. But what I realized when reading that, and asked him the question in a podcast that we're going to be doing, that'll come up soon, is our open society turning towards the second? So if in an open society all things are allowed unless explicitly forbidden, that's fine. But if suddenly we live in a society where all things are talking about anything is explicitly forbidden unless somehow it's universally accepted to be okay, then are we reverting to that closed society in a different way? Not totalitarian because it's imposed by the government, but a closed society which is the opposite of a healthy democracy. Things should be allowed unless explicitly forbidden, and all ideas nothing should be sacred. And if we have this sacred notion of things we're never able to talk about or do, for even ask the question, even to decide that it's horrible, but to ask the question, is it horrible? If just asking the question, is discussing X horrible, gets you fired or gets students protesting, that's a dangerous situation.
Right, and we're in it now.
Well, I don't. Yeah, we are on the we're in it at one level or another, and we're in it in society as well. And it's dangerous. It doesn't mean we can't condemn things, but it means the purpose of free speech is to guarantee speech with which you disagree, right? That's the whole point. It's guarantee the right of people to say something you hate. That's what we should have in a democracy, and that's what we should enshrine in a Bill of Rights: the right of people who you disagree with to speak. And unfortunately, that's the opposite of what's going on. And if that's the case, you can't have a healthy democracy.
Do you think ASU was fair with you, or did they succumb to the political correctness of the time?
ASU is a university that is run by bureaucrats and is worried about exactly those things, and in fact had to, when the fact that I was an atheist would often produce the president would get angry letters, and the question is, at what point do you try and act rationally, and at what point do you try and act for marketing purposes? And so I think what's going on in universities around the country, and ASU is no different than anything else, is that you're seeing that universities are, unfortunately, on many subjects, unwilling to defend the rights of people to speak out and to carry on the kind of intellectual activities that a university should be for, and I'm worried about it.
It's not just universities. I mean, we saw Neil deGrasse Tyson had some allegations against him. They put one of his shows on hold for like a year.
Well, the problem is, we can talk about that. I mean, I don't want to dwell on it, but we are living in a society where allegations, because of the internet, of any sort, can impact on people. And what happens is that obviously due process and all the rest goes by the wayside, because if an allegation can impact you, I'll take an example which will undoubtedly infuriate people, but Justin Trudeau in Canada, the Prime Minister of Canada, I used to remember when his father was Prime Minister, is in a lot of trouble for having dressed up in a costume party about Aladdin with blackface, okay? And one can debate in many ways whether that's a reasonable thing to do, but to dress up in a costume party 25 years ago in a costume party, where if he dressed up as a Frankenstein, no one would have made a difference. He was dressing up as someone else. And some people are immediately offended because it was blackface, and there are issues you can talk about. Reasonable people can have a discussion, but I find it worrisome that the question of whether he might be reelected as Prime Minister will come back to that costume party. And not to the actions that he's done as Prime Minister or the things he's espoused. Of course, you look at people's character and everything else, but when we live in a world where that kind of thing can cancel someone, as in this cancel culture, it's worrisome, right? Because it means that people are going to be afraid if they think that something they believe in or talk about is going to potentially destroy their life. It's the extreme of it was back in the Soviet Union, right? When you knew there are things you could not talk about. People behind the walls talked about it, but you knew there was things you could not publicly say. We look back on that time as an awful period. But what we're doing now is censoring the kind of public conversations and ability to act and behave as a rational, sympathetic human being by removing people or being able to remove people that you disagree with in one way or another, that you like for one reason or don't like, and for whatever actions or thoughts or words they've done, and that's dangerous. That's dangerous. It's not, but I don't think that's what's interesting to me. That's why I don't make predictions about the future. That when I look at science fiction, it always misses the important stuff. I mean, George Orwell's 1984 is a profoundly important book and a terrifying book. But the propaganda, the way the government did it there, they didn't need it. You don't need to do that, okay? What we need now, all you need to do is manipulate. Sure, they talked about manipulating information and war is peace, but in a very crude way. Now you can manipulate the public to do what you want in much more sophisticated ways, and still impact get kind of mob rule by doing that. And we view the world of 1984 with war as peace as an awful world. And what's surprising is it's not necessarily the government directly doing this, but we're in a world where we're perilously close in certain ways to imitating that awful world because we are allowing because of the unexpected power of the internet that hasn't yet been able to be dealt with, the ability for falsifications to have an impact, the ability for accusations, which in the old days would just be that, to be now promoted by clickbait desiring journalists or government to promote. Look what's happening in the United States right now. There may be a crisis, a constitutional crisis, because Donald Trump apparently spoke to the head of the Ukraine about trying to investigate Joe Biden and his son, right? That should be illegal, right? To try and get another government to investigate your political opponent, right? In a democracy, that should be enough to can you, okay? What I read in the right-wing press, in say Fox News, is they suddenly come up and say, oh, this is the end of Joe Biden, that scandal that he needed to be investigated in Ukraine. And so you can pervert things so efficiently by just repeating these lies over and over again that you got to worry. You got to worry.
Yeah. What are the next 10 years like for you? What do you want to do?
Look, the great thing for me, and that's one of the reasons I'd already thought for a long time academia is a very safe place to be. What people don't realize, academia is a really kind of safe environment. And I've always, in some ways, admired people who weren't in it because there's no safety net there. But I also like to think 10 years ago that I would not know what I was doing 10 years from now. I didn't know, before I created the Origins Project at ASU, that I'd be doing that. I like to think in my research, while I would write down for my funding agencies what I'd be doing in the next 5 years in order to get a grant, I and everyone else knew that I certainly hoped I wouldn't be doing in 5 years what I said I'd be doing. Because if I was, I and others wouldn't be making any discoveries in the interim. And so I like to think I have no idea what I'll be doing 5 or 10 years in the future. I plant a lot of seeds. What I'm doing now with this new foundation, the Tax Exempt Foundation, it's producing these things, and the podcast, are things I thought of trying a long time ago, and now I have the opportunity for a variety of reasons, and I'm in a situation where I can try them. They're exciting for me now. But I certainly hope that I'll be doing something else 10 years down the road. My writing is important to me. Maybe I'll be making more movies in different ways. One of the reasons I moved universities almost every 10 years while I was in academia was for the same reason. It's very easy to do the same thing over and over again. And if you move, you can't. You're forced to not do that. And I think always found it very invigorating. So I plant a lot of seeds and see where they grow. And I hope that, I hope I'm doing something really different. Because, life is, it's short and it's fun to try different things.
Yeah.
And it's terrifying. At every time when you give up what you're doing and trying something new, it's terrifying, but it's also exhilarating. And look, I don't want to preach. Many people are just working very hard to make ends meet on a given day, and they don't have that flexibility. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to have the success in my career and to be able to try new things and have that freedom sometimes of time or to be able to try things. And so I'm a lucky person. I view myself as very lucky. I still do.
Yeah. What scares you?
Ignorance. Ignorance and fear, and a worry that the world is governed by that. That drives me to do the public things I do. I think, that's the biggest threat to my own future and the future of other people. And so, I like to think that some people, some people have written to me say, oh, you're fearless or something like that. And I have no problem, I've never had a problem confronting ideology or ignorance on a professional level. I don't think that takes a lot of courage. At least I've never felt it. It takes a lot of courage to confront it if you're in Saudi Arabia or in Afghanistan. I mean, those people are risking their lives, okay? And I'm fortunate to be in a society where I get my hand slapped or I maybe have to leave my job, but I'm on the whole, we're in a very lucky society that we're in. But confronting it on a personal basis is a difficult thing, and then worrying about how to confront a movement that seems so large, is terrifying. Yeah.
What would we be surprised to learn about Lawrence Krauss, besides the fact that you love waistcoats and flashy shoes?
Well, then you wouldn't be surprised to that, right? Because I flaunt that.
And that you can't hit a gong to save your life.
I thought I hit your gong extremely well. I made a very big noise. Let's see. Well, I wouldn't want to tell people because then they would be surprised afterwards, I guess. I guess that I like to play golf.
Is that a new thing for you?
No, I actually learned with a postdoc of mine years and years ago. I have, by the way, some moral objections to many golf courses, or ethical objections because of pesticides and anything else. But there's two things that one that surprised me about golf. I like to go there because I wouldn't think of anything else. It also was a way. It was quiet and a pleasant thing. But what surprised me now is that my wife and I play golf, and I used to have this macho thing that the boys would go play golf, and we played a lovely just a par 3 course near our house in Oregon, and it's a lovely way to spend time together, walking in a pleasant environment, and while there's a very famous book that wrote that golf is a good walk spoiled, for me, since I don't keep score and I don't care. It's for me just a pleasant experience. And I also have the fortunate character flaw that I only remember the good hits.
I think Winston Churchill said it was the great way to ruin a walk, golf.
Yeah, but my motto has always been, as I look at your dog here,
who's named Winston? Yeah,
exactly. The thing that Winston Churchill said to me that has impacted on me and admire tremendously is when he just said, never, ever, 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 ever give up. I think that's just the bottom line. You just keep plugging away, and there's adversity. If in science, as you said, you get to the wrong answer, you keep plugging away. In life, this doesn't work, you try that. And I may have even said in our last program, I certainly said it a number of times, that we don't teach students how to fail effectively, that life is full of obstacles, and you can't let the bastards get you down. You just keep trying.
Amen.
Yeah.
What keeps you awake at night?
Usually good movies that I'm watching.
What do you like to watch?
Oh, I love all film. So I mean all types. And in fact, yeah, especially now that I've been making movies too, I appreciate them more. But I like basically there's no type of movie. Well, the one type of movie I don't like to watch is horror movies. I used to when I was a kid. Although we may be making a vampire movie for a different reason, but I assume I'll be able to watch it after I've done it. But
what else keeps you awake at night?
When I start, well, actually, there are two things that keep me up at night. There's the good things and the bad things. The good things is when I start thinking of an idea, it's a physics idea or something like that. I love lying in bed on those rare days when I have an idea and I can just keep pushing and pushing and pushing it. So those are good nights. They don't happen very, very often, but the rare good nights. The other one is when I start thinking about the challenges of what need to be done and the challenges facing me and the world, the worries of fear and ignorance and how to combat them. I think that really does key. Remember that. Oh, and the other thing, if I've said or done something that's hurt my wife, then I feel miserable and it's hard for me to sleep.
Lawrence, I always have a few questions at the end I'm going to ask you.
Okay.
If you could pick up a magic quantum phone and call the 20-year-old Lawrence and give that young man some advice, what would you tell him?
Oh, the obvious things.
The following success secrets are only available inside the London Real Tribe, where you get exclusive access and insights from our high-performance guests on wealth creation, productivity, leadership, morning routines, health, and well-being. To join our tribe community, go to londonreal.tv/tribe. Now, let's continue with the show.
My life has consisted in learning how little I know, how other people are so much better at me than at so many things. And that's a wonderful thing to learn.
You think people would be surprised to hear that you are humble?
Well, I don't know whether I'm humble as a person, but at least I have the humility to realize that the acceptance over time of seeing people, in physics, of course, I've always seen colleagues who I think are better than me at one thing or another. And in fact, it's very wonderful to be a professor and teach a student and then see that student in whatever area. I mean, they may not be better than me or worse in general as a physicist, but to go beyond where I'm at so that I start, one of the best things about having graduate students is I start teaching them, and by the end of their PhD, they're teaching me. And that's wonderful. So I think I'm willing to I'm amazed at how almost everyone I know is better at me than in something. And I think probably when I was younger, I wasn't as open to that.
Okay. Second part of that question, best advice you ever received could have come from a professor or one of the many people you know in this world or from a parent.
Well, I think two people who mean a lot to me. One was Richard Feynman, who said, "Don't care what people think." Okay, and then a friend of mine, Werner Herzog, was a filmmaker, who said many things that I admire. But once he once looked at me and said, "Chin up and down with the enemy." Okay.
How'd you know Feynman? Where'd you meet him?
I was fortunate enough to meet him when I was a student. First, I was in Canada, and I was one of the heads of an organization called the Canadian Undergraduate Physics Association, and he came up for a conference where it's a long story, but we could talk about why he was there. But I was there with my girlfriend then at the time, who was one of the few women who was there, and so Feynman spent most of the time with us. And then, so I had a weekend with him then, and it was fascinating. I mean, he was charismatic, and it was fascinating to learn. I mean, for all the reasons of people like Feynman, and then periodically met him later as I lectured at Caltech before he died. I think I wrote a book about Feynman called Quantum Man, a scientific biography of Richard Feynman, and I think I said in the introduction that it was a kind of cathartic to write it because when I gave a lecture at Caltech when I was at Harvard. And Feynman was in the audience and asked a question. And it was terrifying, of course, to lecture knowing Feynman was in the audience. And then afterwards, he came up to follow up on it. And I had wanted to remind him, because I was sure he didn't remember me from being a student years before. And I wanted to remind him of that time. And he waited, and then some annoying, obnoxious assistant professor kept badgering me, and Feynman eventually just sort of walked off, you know. And I thought, okay, well, I'll get to tell him another time. And then Feynman died shortly afterwards. And so I always felt like I really should have taken advantage of that time to tell him what I thought. And I've encouraged other people to do that, to do things at the moment and not later. And so writing that book about him was in some ways a chance for me to be able to get that off my chest. But it was a scientific biography, which is, you know, Feynman was a charismatic person, but if that's all he was, he wouldn't have been worth writing about or learning about. In spite of the fact that Feynman loved creating the myth of Feynman and the mythology of Feynman, and he was a showman, and I not only admired that, but I emulate that to some extent. There's no doubt about it. But he still would say, and I think it's absolutely true, that what matters is the science. And what I found lacking from almost all the popular books and discourses by Feynman about Feynman and others was a discussion of his science. And I was asked if I would write a scientific biography, and I agreed to. I had no idea how difficult it would be. but I thought if I could weave his science into his life, then people could understand what it was about Feynman that made him worth reading about, beyond the fact that he was charismatic and funny and had full of anecdotes and and was brilliant. But how he manifested that brilliance in the scientific community and what he did gave a new insights into the man. So I was very pleased with that book. And by the way, that's the book. Two things about that book that one, not that I like to read reviews, but it's the only book I've written that's never gotten any bad reviews. But two, one of the most enjoyable aspects of that book after the fact is another friend of mine named Cormac McCarthy, who's a writer. I know
you know everybody.
Yeah, but read the hardcover and liked it a lot, which I was thrilled with. But Cormac wrote me and said, "I'd like to edit the paperback edition." As he wrote to me in a way only Cormac could write, it's almost perfect, but I could make it perfect. And one of the things he said I had to agree to do was take out all exclamation marks and semicolons, because there was no place in English literature for exclamation marks or semicolons. And I said, whatever, sure. So the paperback version of that book, Quantum Man, says with corrections or with corrections by Cormac McCarthy, and I'm just so, that was such an honor for me.
That's nice. Yeah. He doesn't use exclamation points. That makes sense.
I'm not sure anyone is consistent, and right. Even Cormac, but he was certainly decided. One thing was absolutely true, and I recognize it. I use exclamation marks way too often. I've always had editors for my books, address this, because I tend to talk in exclamation marks, and so right. I write a lot like I speak, and of course then refine it because it's different.
Yeah.
But I use way too many, and I acknowledge that fact. And so it obviously, if you use too many, then it's like crying wolf, right? Then they lose all meaning whatsoever.
Yeah. Feynman taught my dad freshman physics at Caltech in '61.
He took the famous Feynman lectures and survived.
Yeah.
Because they're great lectures, but many people didn't survive them because they probably were too much for many undergraduates to get. Yeah. They're great books to read after the fact. But
listen to them as well. They have the audio tapes.
They have the audio tapes, yeah. And it turns out so they weren't particularly successful at the time because they were probably too much too soon. They're wonderful references.
Yeah.
Amazing references. Yeah. So it would have been amazing. In retrospect, it would have been amazing to take it. But then, if you're in the class, the worst thing you can feel like if you're taking a class is to feel like you're a dummy. And it would probably have been easy in a Feynman class to feel like you're a dummy, and that's the last thing you want to feel like. Yeah. I mean, sometimes it encourages you to do things, but if you get overwhelmed, you just give up.
Yeah, true.
And so it's good to feel challenged, as long as we encourage people to want to feel challenged. That's another thing I worry about. When everyone gets a red ribbon for no matter what they do, then people don't realize that sometimes you have to challenge yourself. Sometimes, you have to actually work harder so I worry about this, the world we live in where every child is always praised and is never challenged, is never confronted, is never offended, is never anything. And so, we want to encourage people to enjoy being challenged instead of being threatened by that.
Last question to that 20-year-old that's out there watching us, listening to us. What do you say to them? What's the advice?
I don't give it, people ask me for lots of things, advice. I get letters every day asking for advice, and I say I don't like to give advice. The only advice I can think of that I always tell them is don't let the bastards get you down. That's it.
Chin up and
down with the enemies. Don't let the bastards get you down.
Okay.
And I think that's useful advice.
Super useful. Lawrence, it's always a pleasure talking to you. I'm always flabbergasted by how many things you're involved with, how many projects you're doing, and you got movies and podcasts, you're traveling the world, you obviously know lots of people because they value you, they value the way you put yourself out there, and I just appreciate everything you do, man. And
I appreciate it. I do. I really do. And I have a lot of nervous energy. I think I'm fundamentally lazy, which is why I do so many different things. But my feeling is that if you plant enough seeds, some of them grow. And so if any of them grow, I feel very honored. And my wife did a lot. For a long time, I felt pretty bad about myself for years and years. It's easy to do, and I guess, because I worried that because if you're a well-known physicist, everyone thinks you're the next Einstein or anything else, and you're not. And she convinced me that I was having a positive impact on the world, and it didn't matter if people misunderstood me or idolized me for the wrong reasons. That I was having an impact, and that I should appreciate that. And I can now do that comfortably and feel good about that. And that's for me a great development.
That's super powerful. Yeah. I remember last time you were here, I watched the Unbelievers, and I had prepped for you and watched all your old interviews and debates, and I was really intimidated by you, and I was just really pleasantly surprised by like how nice and genuine you are as a person, and you know.
I appreciate that. I like to think what you see is what you get, but yeah, I hope so. Well, that's good, and I've enjoyed it too, and I didn't know where we were going to go, but thank you for saying that. That means a lot to me.
No, thank you. Podcast, how do people find it and check it out?
Oh, good. Well, podcast, you can go to the website, which is theoriginspodcast.com, or you can go to iTunes or any of those, or you can go, we have some of the video clips. It's a video podcast, much like this video program. Yeah. It's so video clips are on YouTube, highlight clips. The full video is in Patreon, because that's the way we try and support the podcast. So with a very small amount. And so you can see the full videos plus some bonus content on Patreon. You can listen to it for free, and you can watch those clips for free on YouTube. So any of those ways you want to do it.
Yeah.
And yeah. And it's been fun. And I think what I hope is that people will find the diversity of people we speak to will surprise people, and I think they'll find something that they are interested in, no matter what they thought in advance.
Yeah, I think so. It's quite a guest list, and I know you got many more in the pike. So, looking forward to that.
And by the way, and what's great for me, by the way, is this is one of the first, since we created the podcast, this is almost the first time I've now been back on the other side, so it's been fun to do that too.
Yeah, how's it feel?
Sometimes a little less comfortable, but it's one of the reasons is what you told me is because I'm not used to promoting.
Right.
At least I promote ideas, but I never thought of promoting products so much.
Okay.
But now there's no doubt it's a product, but it's a product I'm proud of. So I'm happy to try and promote it.
I think you did a masterful job.
Oh, well, thank you. There you go. My uncle was a big retail person, so maybe it comes by.
It's in your blood.
Well, yeah.
Lawrence, thanks so much. Really enjoyed this. All the best with your podcast, and until next time.
Thank you. I hope there is a next time.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.